a series of 15 TV shows. He also has served as a prison chaplain in the North Carolina Department of Corrections and the Federal Bureau of Prisons. Today, Imam Sykes is president of the Islamic Society of Leading American Muslims Peace Center. He celebrates diversity, striving to build bridges of peace, dialogue, and understanding, whereby all men and women come together on common ground in pursuit of peace, freedom, and justice for all. Certainly a message that we all need today. We are fortunate to welcome Imam Sykes back to our Triple U pulpit, virtual as it is, where he will continue the conversation he began in May. Imam Sykes, thank you and welcome.
Thank you. It's so good to be with you folks again today. Um, it is time now, and what a time to be alive, to lead in love. Um, I feel like I'm in a circle of some of the best tenders of fire. So again, I want to thank you for this second invitation. That was such a moving song. In Islamophobia 101, we defined Islamophobia. We examined its precursors, contributing factors, the Islamophobia industry, its millionaires. We took a global journey to see how Islamophobia is affecting Muslims all over the world. And today I wanted to focus on how Islamophobia is affecting others. In addition to Muslim women, men, and children, those who share characteristics that have been radicalized as Muslim, whether it be by language, clothing, or skin color, are also affected by Islamophobia. You might remember the story of the Somali youth that were targeted in Minneapolis and shot because they were wearing traditional clothing. Sikhs, Christian Arabs, and Hindu Indians have been targets of anti-Muslim animus. Sikhs have been attacked, shot, and murdered, and often during the process, a comment was made that they were terrorists or Muslims that should go back home. John Singh, a 78-year-old grandfather, was walking to pick up his grandson from school in Bakersfield, California, when a man in a pickup truck called him a terrorist and threw an apple at him with such force that the apple split when it hit him in the head. And there are so many of these stories. Islamophobic acts occur at both an individual and institutional level, and they take many forms. Gawadas had been vandalized, and knowledge is so important. It is essential for peace and concord. Bigotry, hatred, persecution, and discrimination often originate from ignorance, and they perpetuate it. When people are ignorant, they hate, disdain, and don't see the point of learning about the other, the group that they have disdain or ignorance for. Correct knowledge is an important tool for preventing bigotry and discrimination. One of the key means by which understanding can be promoted, whether between the West and the Muslim world or Muslims and other faith groups, is by acknowledging or agreeing on a shared infrastructure, a shared system of rights, respect, and governance. Islamophobia represents the challenge of discrimination in the US today, both in that it stems from ignorance and it promotes ignorance. One school wanted to put a lesson about Islam in its curriculum. They started receiving attacks from the parents who didn't want their children to learn about what they perceived as an evil religion. Bias against Islam and Muslims is preventing people from learning about Islam and Muslims, which could then prevent or ameliorate that violence. You see very clearly now in the US how Islamophobia is used to deprive a group of Americans, American Muslims, of the rights and privileges all American citizens are supposed to enjoy. It is used to prevent them from trying even to access those so-called inalienable rights. The subject today is a nexus between bigotry, ignorance, discrimination, challenges, and threats that prevents the rule of law, the rights in this country. Americans are used to thinking that there is something special about their country and something special about being American. And if they don't preserve the system of rights, constitutional rights in this country, they will not have anything special in a generation or two. It is absolutely crucial for Americans to preserve what we have for all. I'm very happy to see UUUF and Muslim organizations that are doing their part in this arena to lead in this struggle. The Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, ISPU, is a think tank research institution seeking to develop objective, solution-oriented research about challenges and opportunities facing American Muslims. ISPU works in collaboration with many other groups examining the impact of Islamophobia on the wider public. They employ historical context as well as modern day best practices to meet this challenge, and I endeavor to do the same. The Brookings Institute, a nonprofit public policy organization based in DC, penned an article May the 14th, 2018, entitled "The U.S. Will Become Minority White in 2045, Census Project." A read that I haven't finished is William Frey's Diversity Explosion: How New Radical Demographics Are Remaking America, which was released early in 2018. Recommended reading. The Pew Research Center, March the 21st, 2019 article entitled "Looking Ahead to 2050, Americans Are Pessimistic About Many Aspects of Life in the U.S." also got my attention. The year 2050 is when many experts project that America will become a nation without a specific ethnic or racial majority. While some welcome this growing diversity, others see it as a demographic threat and are working to broadly erode the rights of several historically marginalized and minority groups, including American Muslims. The year 2050 is when many experts seeking to offer solutions to the American Muslim community's toughest challenges through sound research, ISPU launched a research project entitled "Islamophobia, a Threat to All." And this is why in the first presentation, we looked at how Islamophobia predominantly affects Muslims globally. Today, I wanted to talk about how many other people are affected by the agenda. This study showed, what this study actually showed is that the whole idea of anti-Muslim bigotry or Islamophobia is far from simply a Muslim problem. This study is that it puts data around the idea that many people have had for a long time, which is that injustice to one is a threat to all. ISPU studied the threat of Islamophobia for 3 years. From the 2010 Time magazine article, "Is America Islamophobic?" came the question, is Islamophobia an isolated phenomenon, or is it part of a broader national process which was underway in the country? A backdrop to this article was the controversy swirling around the Ground Zero Park 51 Mosque in New York, the impending arrival of Pastor Terry Jones from Florida to Detroit in order to ignite the public debate with the burning of Qur'ans, as well as the approaching midterm elections of 2010. So I just want to set a little stage here. Fast forward to November 2012, when on election night, with the re-election of Barack Obama, the following quotes were part of the national discourse as the election returns were coming in. We kept hearing the word demographics. in particularly alluding to various groups based on their ethnicity or their race in part of the conversation and debate of that evening. Implicit within that was an acknowledgement that the country was changing. For some, it seemed it was a lamentable trajectory by which the country was changing. This then comes into the idea, whether you like it or not, that in 2050, or as some estimate now, 2043, that the United States of America is going through a demographic shift, at which point in history this country will become for the first time a majority-minority country. Ryan Miller, in a USA Today article, March the 21st, 2019, entitled 46% of whites worry becoming a majority-minority nation will weaken American culture, surveys say. The implications of this demographic shift are manifold in the areas of political, socioeconomic, cultural, and perhaps more importantly, the intangible perceptual shift in the ways people see and frame this country and the direction of this country. What are the reactions and responses to this shift when it comes to invoking for some a moral panic that America is irreversibly changing course in its own identity? And what does that mean for it, its citizens' positions, stability, and security? Some of the statements I just presented demonstrate that not only is there an awareness of this demographic shift, but that there is an awareness of this demographic shift, particularly among some politicians, individuals in the media, and various opinion makers. I Googled what people are saying about America becoming a majority-minority country and got 166 million results. The task at hand for ISPU was to locate Islamophobia within this broader demographic shift, and in academic terms, find the situationality, I made up a word there, position or circumstances of Islamophobia. Was Islamophobia existing as a unique, isolated phenomenon, or was it part of this moral panic? ISUP analyzed at the state level of legislative action and at the same time identified various pieces of legislation which affected or seemingly targeted groups that were going to be part of the collective of this majority-minority population as it approaches in the year of 2043. And I would invite you to look at ISPU's website. We had some challenges the last time with Zoom. There's a beautiful pie chart that actually breaks this down. As a matter of taking a look at statistics which suddenly seem to be occurring at almost a breakneck frequency, the 2010 census showed that for the first time in American history, the number of non-white, non-Hispanic births was outpacing that of white births. In the 2012, the Pew Center study on religious life in America showed that for the first time in American history, this country was no longer a majority Protestant nation. For some people, these findings have certain profound implications about their own identity and their own security about what it is and what it means to be American. What does it mean to the majority power that is going to slowly become the minority power ostensibly in this country? So what a threat to white privilege. And this is not about white privilege, and I'm not going to shift here. The objectives of this report and the study behind it was to locate Islamophobia within this context, to examine the legislative agenda, not from the federal level, but from the state level, to illustrate then from these takeaways what would raise the awareness of both Muslim Americans as well as the other affected groups in this cross-pollinated overlap phenomenon that has been hypothesized. ISPU's methodology identified 6 areas that were part of the public debate in a very amplified way over the 3 years from 2010 to 2013. And by the way, if you remember in the last lecture, this is when Bridget Gabriel and Pamela Geller gained notoriety. One was the debates over voter rights for access, and many of you will remember this, the debates dealing with voter identification. Number 2 was immigration, this time at the state level. Case in point, Arizona's 2010 SB 1070, the broadest and strictest anti-illegal immigration measures passed in the United States in history. Number 3 was reproductive rights access, reproductive health care rights access. Number 4 was the debates at the state level swirling around about same-sex marriage after the debates that were occurring in Washington regarding the Defensive Marriage Act, denying same-sex couples all benefits and recognitions given to opposite-sex couples. Number 5, coming from Michigan, one of the very fecund debates was on the issue of collective bargaining and right to work, examining labor unions and what was the legislative agenda that was affecting them. Number 6 was looking at anti-Sharia, so-called anti-foreign law legislation. In each of these 6 areas, ISPU's research found that there are different groups, some overlapping, that were going to be affected. Thus, I thought the song was so appropriate today. All of these groups are sitting around the fire, trying to tend the fire. According to the research, public debates and voter ID laws were seeming to have a disproportionate impact on minority communities, African American, Hispanic American, and Arab Americans, just to name a few. Immigration issues, of course, being self-evident, abortion rights access, of course, being self-evident on the issue of gender, same-sex marriage, of course, affecting the LGBTQ+ community, the right to work legislation affecting labor unions, and finally, anti-Sharia legislation affecting Muslim American communities. ISPU examined the legislation regarding these issues on a 50-state level with a time frame of somewhere between 2010 and 2013. They examined bills that were sponsored, co-sponsored, or proposed, seeing if they died in committee, if they came up for a vote, if that vote failed, and in fact, that vote was passed, and those bills were actually enacted into law. Some of the key findings this research demonstrated were things that for some might seem to be of no great surprise, for others they seem to yield quite profound new information. The purpose of the study wasn't to provide a aha or a wow factor one way or the other. This think tank simply chronicled what the data in fact demonstrated. One of these findings was that so-called red states, or those states that tended to be dominated by Republicans, and more specifically states that had a so-called monopoly of one political party, that is, that the governor and the legislature were dominated by Republicans, had the most restrictive legislative agenda in these 6 respective areas. The data in ISPU's research also showed that among this group of a specific political party, that it was actually a very small portion of legislatures of that particular political party that were responsible for the lion's share of this legislation. Presenting then the phenomenon of what they operationally defined as overlap legislators, those who were involved in supporting one or more legislative agendas in these different categories, they found that out of roughly 3,800 Republican state legislators nationwide, it was shown that only 630, about 16.5%, had sponsored or co-sponsored an anti-Sharia, anti-foreign law bill, depending on how it was framed at that particular legislative forum. The data also show that 8% of the 102 anti-Sharia bills proposed within this 3-year period had at least one overlap legislature, the highest of all 6 issues areas. Interestingly enough, the greatest level of overlap was not between anti-Sharia, anti-foreign law legislation and immigration legislation, but in fact, the correlation seemed to be between anti-Sharia legislation and strict voter identification laws. The correlation was a cross-pollination between anti-Sharia and voter ID laws, as well as right-to-work laws. Now, I would pause and ask this question for a moment. Whose best interest would that be in with the 2050 prophecies? I think these are very valuable questions for those of us sitting around tending the fire. Who is going to work, police, and be in control? The old majority, the systemic old majority, or the new minority majority? One of the facilitating examples in the study was what was called the curious case of North Carolina, where HB 695, the Faith, Family, and Freedom Protection Act of 2013, was initially promoted as an anti-Sharia bill to prevent ostensibly the implementation of Islamic law in North Carolina, preventing state judges from considering foreign law, including Sharia, in family court proceedings. And by the way, Act for America was one of the leading organizations promoting this bill. So Act for America is one of the organizations that I presented last time, were among those Islamophobia industries. In the 11th hour, there was a piggyback legislation added to this bill which restricted access to reproductive health. This was and is a concrete example whereby legislation from 2 different areas was combined. Now, we can call it an act of legislative laxity, an act of legislative expedience, or an act of opportunism, because there was a conceit that people wouldn't challenge, protest, or oppose in North Carolina very vociferously the anti-Sharia bill. This then provided fair cover for the anti-abortion bill to pass relatively easy there. And I think if you take a deeper look at some of the populations affected by some of these situations, you will be able to see and see some very clear patterns here. So I call this a red herring. This seems to affirm the notion of overlap and a certain cross-pollination of integration among these 6 areas. The implementation, as well as the implications of this research and report, are equally manifold. It demonstrates, first of all, that Islamophobia is not really an isolated or unique phenomenon, either historically or within the contemporary context, which of course defies how even many Muslim Americans might perceive it. It seems as though it is part and parcel of a broader phenomenon occurring in the US, which seems tied to this idea as the country marches toward, and some might contend slouches toward, 2043, and the ramifications of the country's identity changing forthwith. Muslims are then part of a changing America rather than necessarily seen as an invading force. Despite the fact that the rhetoric around Sharia and anti-Sharia legislation seems to be so othering, the measures that are being taken to place a firewall against anti-Sharia legislation seems to also be within the same matrix, tactics, and strategy as that which is affecting other minority communities. For the American Muslim population, of course, then this just allows for increased self-awareness and education, not only about the situationality of Islamophobia with its broader and political landscape, but it also demonstrates then an opportunity to gain greater education about these other 5 issue areas and the correlations and integrations therein. So hopefully we will all be sitting around tending the fire together. Muslim Americans need to take a step back and reassess the political context and become more engaged along a broader category of issues rather than ones that are necessarily badged as Muslim explicitly. This research demonstrates and provides a clarion call for exploring the potential intersections with other issues, as well as the ability to then collaborate across issue lines with other groups. Contrary to popular opinion or perception, this research also demonstrated that the number of individuals, the percentage of individuals involved in exercising an agenda which is affecting them directly through anti-Sharia law is relatively small. For the broader American population, this report is intended to develop engagement and a contextual understanding of how Muslim demographics and related issues correlate to many of the broader public debates that are and will continue to be in the engagement and conversation of many in this country moving to the 2043 and 2050 prophecies. For Muslims, they can recognize potential organizations and communities that have experienced similar strategies or targeted legislation for collaboration and cooperation. It identifies and integrates the Muslim impact component of wider legislative and policy concerns. The research offers insight for engagement with existing and emerging pockets of Muslim activists across the country. Another key component of this data and its accessibility for the general public through ISPU's website, and I would ask all of you to take a note of that, some beautiful cross-sectional work and research available for free there. ISPU's website is a data visualization map on the homepage of this study, along with each of the reports that are concomitant to this study, which then demonstrate how legislative record on a state-by-state level can be accessed, assessed, analyzed, and interpreted by anyone who so chooses. So you can go on this site, click on a tab, drop it down, and look at all of these cross-sectional issues and see how we need to be working toward the new America. Not making it great the way that it was, but making it great in diversity. If someone wanted to isolate a particular year or a particular issue like right to vote, one can then see on a state-by-state level and on a politician-by-politician level, voting records of those people who sponsored or played a very active and central role in that piece of legislation. It's a very valuable tool for activists. In addition, there is the ability to examine the status of said piece of legislation, whether it was now dead or on arrival at committee, if it was still pending, if the respective legislative house, or if in fact it has been passed or enacted. So this ability to then map these various areas of legislative content will hopefully provide some tangible and empirical data for those who are interested in, at the very least, seeing what is the current situation in these various areas and issues of groups, and also to be able to track a trajectory as the country moves toward its inevitable status or restatus of being a majority-minority country. So again, to take America back to the way that it used to be, rather than adjusting to the demographic shifts and embracing them, is problematic. So I want to spend the last few minutes I have with you talking about the way forward and then having some time for question and answers. So the first thing that I would encourage you to do in terms of embracing or countering Islamophobia is to start with yourself and reflect on how you or your ancestors fit in or were excluded. And please forgive me, but I think that it was Carl that's a new citizen. My wife went through that as well from South Africa. Reflect on how you and your ancestors fit in or were excluded. Biases you have encountered in your own life, how are these similar to or different from those encountered by Muslims? Learn more about Islam and Muslims, and I would like to say use primary sources, not those that have been published by Islamophobes. Let us examine prevalent stereotypes and dig deeper to challenge common assumptions. How do we challenge our assumptions? We use knowledge, correct knowledge, to counter Islamophobia. Use your knowledge to recognize misinformation, distortions, and misrepresentations. I would encourage you and ask you to respond when you hear bigoted statements against any minority group or any other group as far as that's concerned. To respond politely and tactfully, but firmly. Inquire where a person is getting their information. Point people toward reliable sources. Be honest and objective. And I think that's true interfaith work. I think the kumbaya kind of meetings where we just agree and never talk about where we really disagree, that's sort of the surface level. But when we really get into these groups and tend the fire and talk about our differences and agree to disagree and celebrate each other, working together to have peace for all, I think we will have the most beautiful America. It is important to distinguish as well between legitimate criticism and prejudice. Engage with Muslims. Get to know your Muslim neighbors, co-workers, and parents in your child's classroom. Greet them, converse with them, and invite them over for a cup of tea or coffee. They may be hesitant at first, but will warm up and build trust over time. So a lot of us are suffering sort of from PTS syndrome. We've been badgered up pretty badly, and sometimes we are afraid when people open their hearts to us. I want to say that key to all of the phobias, the bigotries, the prejudice, and since I am talking about Islamophobia, is internet engagement. Education and interfaith engagement are key. Islamophobia is fed by ignorance, and sound knowledge is the best antidote to bias. Knowledge about Muslims and their faith helps counter falsehoods and misrepresentations. Face-to-face interactions at educational events prevent stereotypes at a young age. And I remember some of the greatest work historically was with the Daughters of Abraham. Just phenomenal interfaith results that we had on the south side of town when we were working. Interfaith engagement is a powerful tool for sharing commonalities and understanding differences. And I think we need to see the balance there. We need to talk about what we agree on and what we disagree on, and then still tend the fire together. Pluralism and religious freedom. The United States was founded on the concept of religious freedom and pluralism. Together, we can reject prejudice and bigotry and create a society and world based on mutual respect and understanding. And I invite you to join me in that today. And I will open up the floor now for questions. And there is a chat question that somebody sent me, and I wanted to, or sent. Let's see.
I have, let me see if I can There's one chat question. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Okay. There are concerns about the Taliban allowing women's education. What are your thoughts about those who see the Taliban speaking for all Muslims? That's from Amanda Major.
Okay, thank you, Amanda. Great question. Well, first and foremost, I hate to break it to you, but Arabs are a minority in the Muslim world. The largest record anywhere recorded is that Arabs are only 20% of the Muslim world. So, and most people are looking at that type of terrorism. What are we looking at? Um, we do have Afghanistan and various other places where there are terrorists, but who was the loudest when we think of terrorists? We think of Osama bin Laden. What's very interesting is that these groups that don't want people to be educated, the root word of Taliban, Talib is a student. So the very ones that don't want the women to be educated, their name says student. um, so really and truly, according to, and I presented some of these figures in the last lecture, um, it's not the Muslim terrorists that we need to be worried about. It's the supremacist groups in America that we need to be worried about. And this is statistically proven. Um, the Taliban is so disunited that, one day it's ISIL, one day it's ISIL. They aren't even united on a name. And the only way you have any value or respect in this country is to have a flag. They don't even have a flag. So I really genuinely, and I want to honor people's concerns, but I also want to try to provide, some empirical data when we're talking about this, because it's far, blown out of proportion in the media. I was just looking the other day. I was reading an article, and it was some research had been done that 80% of ABC and CBS and 60% of Fox coverage of Muslims is negative. And so anybody else on this chat, except for my students, probably could go out, go postal, unload a gun in a parking lot, and your religion will never be mentioned. If I would do that, the top headline will be radical retired prison chaplain, Imam, local terrorist. So there is, we have a lot of things I think we need to work on, but I really think we'll get more bang for the buck if we come together and sit around the table of these political issues that I'm talking about, because these are going to affect our country.
Another question here is from David Bottomley. Is Islamophobia a form of anti-Semitism?
I love you, David. It's good to see you again, man. David and I go back a long time, and certainly we're first cousins from Ismail and Isaac. And so, yes, there's an anti-Semitic flair and to Islamophobia, no question about. And if you notice, it's really hard based on the research to see which group is receiving the most phobia, the Jews or the Muslims. And really, it's very hard to, when you read the material. I don't know. So, of course, each person likes to think they're the biggest victim. I don't know who's the biggest one, but I know that my Jewish brothers and sisters are also suffering from a lot of phobia still in this country.
I will scroll through and see if I see anyone with a hand raised. A lot of people don't have video, so okay. Not seeing any other hands. Imam, we would love to thank you for your amazing. Oh, I'm sorry. Martha Kirby, unmute yourself, Martha.
Miguel Rodriguez may be the last question.
Oh, my bad. Sorry, Miguel.
No, it's okay.
Hi, good morning.
Hi, Miguel.
Good morning.
Imam Sykes, brother, good to see you. Hello.
Hello.
My question is, are you seeing after the George Floyd, in particular, um, uh, incident, and even before then, have African Americans joined in support of Muslims in their struggle to for equal rights and respect, and vice versa? Has the Islamic community joined groups like Black Lives Matter? Or are you seeing maybe more of that now as an uptick since George Floyd?
Actually, an awesome question, and I'll ask all of the audience to forgive me because I wrote actually on this piece of paper today to begin by talking about George Floyd, and because it wasn't on my actual notes, it completely I missed it. Um, Actually, ISNA, which is, and according to the figures, ISNA or ICNA, the two largest national organizations, we are doing a lot of speeches, communal work. We've been doing protests, silent, passive um, protests. A lot of the Muslim communities have been out protesting. Um, this touched on some very beautiful pieces, Miguel, in terms of those tending the fire, because you have to, most people might recognize that historically, the people of color came over on the ship and established Islam in America for a long time. And then really Islam really came into the light under the direction of what I would say Warathdin Muhammad. Many would say Elijah Muhammad. They were brothers. But really they were pioneers in understanding about racism and understanding about Islamophobia. They were some of the earliest people. The slaves were beaten if they were found with their Quran. They weren't allowed to recite their Quran. And I was thinking, if we look at early policing, and I will ask in advance for forgiveness if I overstep my bounds, but this week I was reading about the earliest policing in America. Well, where did that take place? And it took place in the South, where all the slaves were. And what were the policemen trained to do? They were trained to run after the escapees. Well, who were those escapees? Many times they were people of color, and sometimes those people of color were Muslims. And they were trained to nearly beat them to death before they returned them to their slaves, owners, the slave owners, and then the slave owners would have their go with them. So we are taking a stance, a very strong, the National Organizations of Islam, the Scholars of Islam, we are taking very strong stances about specifically about secular racism, systemic racism. We're trying to get our African American imams that have the very best of this history. I have about 12 books. Matter of fact, someone recently called me and said they were going to go into chaplaincy and they were going to be in the prison. And I said, well, you can't go into chaplaincy until you read all of these books. And they laughed. They were calling me for advice. You have to understand this history if you're going to work with the majority people of color population. I was one of 10 imams for the Department of Justice and the only one that looks like I do now. I'm not white, I'm red. But it created a whole set of learning for me because I represented, I was the symbol of the white systemic racism, of white privilege, and really a great and humbling experience and a gift from the people of color that I work with in my life. And it makes me emotional because historically, it had been the white people that hated me as a Muslim, and it had been the African American people that embraced me the most. And what is sad, though, also I have to touch on this, Miguel, you really opened up Pandora's box for me this morning. We have struggled, many of us, to raise the consciousness of the contribution of African American Muslims, because often they're not accepted among mainstream Muslims. I'm just telling what it is. I'm not going to dress it up. I'm not going to hide what is. That even that they've had to fight to be recognized. I will never forget when Warithdin Muhammad passed away, what little recognition he got as such an influential, masterful leader. So I hope I answered your question, and if I didn't, please remind me. That one hit that passion button of mine.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome, brother. Thank you so much. And I'm sorry, Warithdin Muhammad was Elijah Muhammad's son, not his brother. Somebody's just correcting me here.
Iman, again, thank you so, so much for that. I think we're a little bit over time, but I'm sure that if anyone else does have a question.
And by the way, there was some request was it a request for the suggestions I'd made?
Yes, Imam, that was Judith.
Okay.
Yeah.
I will send them to, I don't think I have Judith's email, but I'll send them to Martha. How's that?
That'd be great.
That'd be perfect.
That'd be great.
Okay, I'm going to wrap us up now, and I just wanted to say, yesterday, those of you that have Netflix, I watched 13th on Netflix yesterday. It's about the 13th Amendment and how we went from saying, okay, no slavery, but there's no slavery allowed unless you are convicted of a crime. And so that's how they began to criminalize the entire Black race in this country in order to continue to have slave labor. Very powerful documentary, and I highly recommend it. Okay, my closing words. Boy, I forgot to break down the author of these. I will find it and get back to you. I apologize. But the words are, nothing better protects a human being against the stupidity of prejudice, racism, religious or political sectarianism, and exclusivist nationalism than the truth that invariably appears in great literature, that all men and women of all nations and places are essentially equal, and only injustice sows among them discrimination, fear, and exploitation. Thank you. And now we're going to extinguish our chalice. If you'll join me with the words, we extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. And I hope that is soon, my friends. I would imagine that we stay on for a few minutes so everybody can say hi to everybody else, and that's fine.
But in about 6 of those minutes, I'm going to log us all off because I have to start Ari.
Yeah.
So you only have a few moments if you want to wave to somebody. Otherwise,
Take us the link.